"You'll be fine with just bread," my mom said, then watched my kids cry while she served steak to my sister's family. That night, I packed everything and left her house for good. The smell of the steak was the first betrayal. It was thick and rich, a promise of something good, something special. It curled up the stairs from the kitchen, a phantom finger beckoning my children, Leo and Maya, from their room where they were quietly building a city out of worn wooden blocks. They were good kids, quiet kids. They had learned to be. Living in my mother's house for the past 6 months had taught them that small voices and small movements were the currency of peace. But the smell of cooking beef, seared in butter and garlic, was too powerful a siren song for a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old to ignore. They came tumbling out, their faces bright with a rare, uncomplicated hope. It was Sunday. Sunday dinner was a tradition my mother, Eleanor, clung to with the tenacity of a drowning woman clutching a splintered log. It was her stage, her courtroom, her weekly address to the nation of our fractured family, and we were all required to attend. My sister, Sarah, was already there with her husband, Mark, and their 2 perfect children, Amelia and James. I called them the show ponies. It wasn't fair to the kids, I knew that, but it was the only way I could mentally frame their existence in that house. They were always dressed in clothes that looked like they'd been plucked from a magazine photo shoot, their hair perfectly combed, their manners impeccable. They sat at the grand mahogany dining table, their little legs dangling, looking like tiny, serene adults. Mark was talking to my mother, laughing at something she said, his voice a low, agreeable rumble. Sarah was helping set the table, her movements graceful and efficient. She caught my eye as I herded my own children into the room and gave me a small, tight smile. It was her, "I'm sorry, but this is just how it is" smile. I'd seen it 1,000 times. It was the smile of a willing accomplice. "Ah, there they are," my mother announced, turning from the stove. She wiped her hands on a pristine white apron tied tightly around her waist. She looked at Leo and Maya, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It never did when she looked at them. It was as if she were inspecting produce she had no intention of buying. "Go wash your hands. Dinner is almost ready." Her voice was clipped, efficient. It was the voice of a woman who was performing a duty, not an act of love. My kids scurried off to the downstairs bathroom, their earlier excitement already dimming under the cold weight of her gaze. I knew the feeling. I had lived with it my entire life. It was a constant, low-grade chill, the kind you get when you sit in a draft for too long. You get used to it, you stop noticing it, until you step into a warm room and realize you've been shivering for years. I took my seat at the table, the spot furthest from her, as always. It was an unspoken arrangement. The seats of honor flanking Eleanor were for Sarah and Mark. The middle ground was for the grandchildren, a buffer zone. My seat was at the far end, the caboose of the family train. From there, I had a perfect view of the whole pathetic tableau. The heavy, polished wood of the table, the glint of the good silver she only used on Sundays, the crystal water glasses that seemed to hum with tension. Everything in that room was a prop in the play of her perfect family, a play in which I was eternally miscast. Sarah finished placing the last fork and sat down, smoothing her dress over her knees. She avoided my gaze again. She was good at that. She had a PhD in conflict avoidance with a minor in plausible deniability. The children returned, their hands scrubbed raw, and clambered into their chairs. Leo immediately started fidgeting with his napkin, a nervous habit he developed since we moved in. Maya just stared at her empty plate, her small face a mask of anxious anticipation. Then, my mother made her grand entrance from the kitchen. She carried a large platter, and on it rested a magnificent piece of roasted beef, a prime rib, glistening and browned to perfection. It was surrounded by roasted potatoes and carrots, glazed and beautiful. The smell was overwhelming, a thick blanket of savory comfort that felt like a lie. She placed it in the center of the table with a flourish. "There we are," she said, beaming at Sarah and Mark. "I know it's your favorite." Mark rubbed his hands together. "Eleanor, you've outdone yourself. It looks incredible." My mother preened, her chest puffing out slightly. This was what she lived for. The adoration, the confirmation of her role as the magnanimous matriarch, the benevolent provider. She picked up the carving knife and fork, her instruments of power. She carved off a thick, juicy slice for Mark, the pink center perfectly cooked. Then another for Sarah. Then smaller but still generous portions for Amelia and James, who squealed with delight. She served herself a modest slice, the queen tasting her own feast. The platter, now significantly diminished, sat before her. My plate and the plates of my children remained starkly, accusingly white. Leo's stomach rumbled. It was a loud, embarrassing noise in the suddenly quiet room. He blushed, a deep crimson that spread from his neck to his ears. Maya looked from the platter to her plate, her lower lip beginning to tremble. I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. I knew what was coming. I had seen variations of this scene play out my whole life, but never so cruelly, never with my children as the primary audience. It was one thing to starve me of affection, of approval, of support. It was another thing entirely to do this. My mother looked up, her eyes sweeping over my children and me as if she'd just noticed we were there. Her expression was one of mild, feigned surprise. "Oh," she said, her voice light, airy, and laced with steel. She picked up a basket from the sideboard. It was filled with plain, dry slices of white bread. She walked over and placed it on the table in front of me, next to my empty plate. It landed with a soft, dull thud. "You'll be fine with just bread," she said. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at Sarah, a small, conspiratorial smile playing on her lips. "We have to watch our budget, after all, and steak is such a luxury." The words hung in in the air, thick and poisonous. We have to watch our budget. The we was her. The budget was the pittance I paid her for rent. Every single penny I earned from my part-time data entry job. A job I could do from the small, damp bedroom in her basement. A job she had so graciously allowed me to keep. The implication was clear. I was a drain, a charity case. My children and I were not worthy of the luxury of a Sunday steak. We were the bread eaters, the peasants at the far end of the Queen's table. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the clink of Mark's fork against his plate as he, oblivious or willfully ignorant, cut into his steak. Sarah stared at her plate, her face pale. Even the show ponies, Amelia and James, seemed to sense that something was wrong. They looked from our empty plates to their full ones, confusion clouding their perfect little faces. Then, the dam broke. A single, fat tear rolled down Maya's cheek, followed by another. A small, choked sob escaped her lips. Leo, ever the protective older brother, put his arm around her, but his own eyes were glistening. He looked at me, his expression a heartbreaking mix of confusion, shame, and a plea for me to fix it. "Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It felt like I had swallowed broken glass. "What are you doing?" She finally turned her gaze to me. Her eyes were cold, flat, like river stones. "I'm teaching you a lesson about gratitude, Catherine," she said, her voice low and even. "You come into my house expecting a free ride. You and your children. You need to understand the value of things. You need to understand your place." Her words were for me, but her performance was for the rest of the table. She was the righteous mother, teaching her wayward daughter a hard but necessary lesson. That was it. That was the moment. The click, the snap, the sound of a chain that had been wrapped around my soul for 34 years finally breaking. It wasn't a loud, dramatic shattering. It was a quiet, internal severance. All the little cruelties, the backhanded compliments, the constant comparisons to Sarah, the gaslighting, the rewriting of history, it all coalesced into this one perfect, unforgivable act. Watching my children cry while she served steak to my sister's family, humiliating them for the crime of being my children, of being poor, of needing her. And in that moment of horrifying clarity, I felt a strange calm descend. The rage was there, a white-hot furnace in my chest, but it was contained. It was fuel now, not just fire. I looked across the table, past my weeping children, past the basket of dry bread, past my sister's bowed head, and met my mother's gaze. And for the first time, I think she saw me. Not the broken daughter, not the charity case, but someone else. Someone she didn't recognize. There was a witness to this. My Uncle David, my mother's younger brother, was sitting quietly at the corner of the table. He rarely came for Sunday dinner, finding my mother's company as taxing as I did, but he'd been roped in for some reason today. He was a kind, gentle man, a retired history professor who had always treated me with a quiet, unassuming warmth. Throughout the entire grotesque performance, he had remained silent, his face growing progressively grimmer. He hadn't touched his own steak. Now, as my mother delivered her line about my place, his fork clattered onto his plate. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the polished floor. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low but carrying an authority I had never heard from him before. "That is quite enough." My mother's head snapped toward him, her face a mask of indignation. "David, this is a family matter. This is between me and Catherine." "No," he said, standing up. "It stopped being a family matter when you decided to use hungry children as props in your little psychodrama. This is shameful." He looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. That look was everything. It was the validation I had been starved for my entire life. It was a hand reaching out in the dark, confirming that the monster I saw was real, that I wasn't the crazy one. He was my hidden advantage. He was the one person in the room whose judgment my mother, for all her bluster, actually feared. His disapproval was a crack in her armor of righteousness. I didn't need to say another word. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. I gently wiped Maya's tears with my thumb. "Come on, sweetie," I whispered. I took Leo's hand. "Let's go upstairs." I didn't look at my mother. I didn't look at my sister. I walked my children out of that dining room, away from the smell of the steak and the sight of the bread, their small, trembling hands clutching mine. As we climbed the stairs, I could hear Uncle David's voice, low and angry, and my mother's, high and defensive. The battle was raging downstairs, but my war was already over. I had surrendered, and in doing so, I had finally won. That night, while the house slept, I packed everything we owned into black trash bags and 2 worn suitcases. I left her house for good, and I never, ever looked back. Upstairs, in the small room that had been our cage for 6 months, I held my children. They cried themselves out, their small bodies shaking with a grief too profound for their years. They didn't understand the complex layers of cruelty, the history of slights and manipulations. They only understood the raw, simple hurt of being denied, of being shamed. They understood that Grandma had been mean. Maya, her face buried in my shoulder, kept whispering, "Why, Mommy? Why doesn't Grandma like us?" And Leo, trying to be brave, just held onto my arm, his knuckles white, and said, "I wasn't even that hungry." It broke my heart into a million pieces. How do you explain to a child that the monster isn't under the bed, but sitting at the head of the dining room table? How do you tell them that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the worst? I couldn't give them the real answers, not yet, so I gave them the only comfort I had. I held them close, rocked them, and whispered promises. "It's okay. We're going to be okay. Mommy's got you. We're not going to be sad here anymore." I promised them a new home, a safe home, a home where no one would ever make them feel small again. I promised them steak. I promised them we would have steak every night if they wanted. It was a silly, desperate promise, but it was all I had. And as I held them, my own tears silent, the furnace of rage in my chest began to cool, hardening into something solid and sharp. It hardened into resolve. After they finally fell asleep, curled together in the single bed they shared, their faces still tear-streaked, I began to move. I felt like a spy in my own life, every creak of the floorboards a potential betrayal. I pulled out the tattered suitcases from the back of the closet and the box of trash bags I kept under the sink. I worked with a methodical, silent fury. I packed their clothes first, the worn-out jeans and faded t-shirts. I packed their few precious toys, the wooden blocks, Maya's one-eyed teddy bear, Leo's collection of superhero figures. Each item felt heavy with the weight of our compromised life. Then I packed my own meager belongings, the handful of books I owned, the 2 pairs of work pants, the framed photo of my kids from before the divorce, before we had to come crawling back here. As I packed, my mother's words echoed in my head. Your place. For years, she had been defining my place for me. I was the difficult one, the sensitive one, the one who made bad choices. After my husband left, after I lost my job and my apartment in the span of 3 months, she had taken me in, and she had never let me forget it. Every meal was a reminder of my dependence. Every dollar she loaned me was another link in the chain. She'd insisted on being on my bank account to help me manage my finances. She'd offered to drive the kids to school, to take some of the pressure off, which was really just another way to monitor my comings and goings. She had woven a web of obligation and control around me, and I, in my desperation, had walked right into it. The bread and the steak wasn't an isolated incident. It was a grand finale. It was her dropping the mask completely, confident that I was too trapped, too weak, too beaten down to do anything about it. She had miscalculated. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on the bedroom door. My heart leaped into my throat. I froze, a stack of Leo's t-shirts in my hands. The knock came again, gentle. "Catherine, it's David." I sagged with relief. I opened the door a crack. My uncle stood in the dim hallway, his face etched with concern. He looked past me at the suitcases and the trash bags on the floor. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly. "I thought so," he said quietly. "Do you have a place to go?" I shook my head, the shame of it a fresh wave of heat on my face. "No, not yet. I was going to, I don't know, a motel. Figure it out in the morning." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. "You're not going to a motel," he said, his voice firm. He pressed the keys into my hand. "My apartment. I'm staying with a friend tonight, closer to the university. I told Eleanor I was too angry to stay here. The place is yours. For as long as you need it. No questions, no rent. Just go." Tears pricked my eyes again, but these were different. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. "David, I can't. It's too much." "Don't be ridiculous," he said, his voice softening. "Eleanor is my sister. I love her, but I am not blind. I have watched what she does, what she has always done, to you. I've tried to intervene in my own quiet way over the years, but I always backed down. Tonight was different." I saw those children's faces. "I'm not backing down anymore. This isn't just for you, Catherine. It's for me too. Let me do this, please." I clutched the keys in my hand. They felt solid, real. A key to a door, a key to an escape. "Okay," I whispered. "Thank you." He nodded, then looked down the hall toward the master bedroom. "She's taken a sleeping pill. She always does after one of her episodes. She'll be out until morning. You should go now." He gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Call me when you're settled. We'll talk tomorrow. We'll make a plan." And then he was gone, a quiet shadow disappearing down the stairs. His intervention was the lifeline I didn't even know I was praying for. It transformed my desperate, half-cocked escape into a viable plan. I worked faster now, fueled by adrenaline and the concrete possibility of freedom. I wrote a short, simple note and left it on my pillow. "We're gone. Do not try to contact us." It was stark, cold, and utterly insufficient to convey the lifetime of pain that led to it, but it was all she deserved. The final, most difficult part was getting the kids to the car. I woke them gently, whispering that we were going on a surprise adventure. They were groggy and confused, but they trusted me. I dressed them in their coats over their pajamas. Maya was half asleep, her head lolling on my shoulder as I carried her. Leo, ever my little soldier, took one of the lighter bags without being asked and held my hand tightly. Each trip down the stairs and out to my beat-up sedan was a heart-stopping exercise in stealth. The house was filled with the ghosts of past arguments, the air thick with unspoken resentments. Every creak of the floor felt like a scream. I expected a light to flick on at any moment, for my mother's voice to slice through the darkness, pulling us back in, but the house remained silent. The sleeping pill was doing its work. We were ghosts, slipping away unnoticed. I buckled the kids into the back seat, where they immediately fell back asleep, their heads leaning against each other. I put the last bag in the trunk and got into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key in the ignition. The engine turned over with a low rumble that sounded like a roar in the silent suburban street. I pulled away from the curb and I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I drove through the sleeping town, following the directions to Uncle David's apartment, the streetlights blurring through my tears. We were free, and we were utterly, terrifyingly alone. Uncle David's apartment was a sanctuary. It was a small, 2-bedroom place above a quiet bookstore, filled with the comforting scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. It was cluttered with books and historical maps, but it was clean and it was warm. Most importantly, it was safe. I carried the sleeping children inside and tucked them into the bed in the spare room. They didn't even stir. I covered them with a thick quilt that smelled of cedar. For a long time, I just stood in the doorway, watching them breathe. The steady, even rhythm of of their chests rising and falling was the most beautiful sound in the world. They were safe. I had gotten them out. I spent the rest of the night not sleeping, but planning. I sat at his small kitchen table with a notepad and a pen, a cup of tea growing cold beside me. The adrenaline of the escape was wearing off, replaced by the cold, hard reality of my situation. I had no job that wasn't tied to my mother's house. I had a few $100s in my wallet and a bank account that my mother could access and likely already had. I had 2 children who needed to be fed, clothed, and registered for a new school. I had a car that was on its last legs. The mountain before me was immense, and for a moment the sheer scale of it threatened to crush me. The temptation to see this as an impossible task, to crawl back and beg for forgiveness, was a seductive whisper in the back of my mind. It was the voice of a lifetime of conditioning, the voice that said, "You can't make it on your own. You need her." I picked up the pen and started to write. I made a list. Step 1, secure finances. Step 2, find a job. Step 3, find a new place to live. Step 4, school. Step 5, legal. The list grew longer and longer, each item a small, manageable stone I could use to build a wall between my new life and my old one. Writing it down made it feel possible. It turned the overwhelming panic into a series of tasks. This was the beginning of my evidence compilation, not for a court of law, but for the court of my own mind. I needed to prove to myself that I could do this. The next morning, I called my work and quit. It was a terrifying leap of faith. The woman on the phone was confused. "But Eleanor said you were so happy with the arrangement." I just told her my circumstances had changed. Then I called the bank. My worst fears were confirmed. The account, which held my last paycheck, had been emptied at an ATM at 6 in the morning. She had woken up, found the note, and her first act had been one of financial retaliation. I felt a surge of sickness, but also a strange sense of vindication. It was exactly what I expected her to do. It was proof. I instructed the bank to freeze the account and remove her name from it, a process that would involve paperwork and time I didn't have. For now, the money was gone. I told the kids that we were having an extended sleepover at Uncle David's. They were thrilled. They explored the apartment with wide-eyed wonder, treating the stacks of books like mountains and the worn Persian rugs like islands in a lava-filled sea. For the first time in months, I heard them laugh, really laugh, with full-bodied, uninhibited joy. The sound was like water in a desert. It was everything. It was the reason I was doing this. That afternoon, Uncle David came by. He brought groceries and 2 large pizzas. We sat on the floor of his living room, eating out of the boxes, and for the first time, it felt like we were a family. Not a dysfunctional hierarchy of power and control, but a small, messy, loving unit. He and I talked while the kids watched a movie. I told him about the bank account. He just sighed and shook his head. "Of course she did," he said. He took out his checkbook and wrote me a check, a sum that made me gasp. "This is not a loan," he said, cutting off my protests before they could start. "This is an investment in you, in those kids. My sister has a debt to you that can never be repaid. Let me at least try to balance the scales a little. Use it to get on your feet. First and last month's rent, a security deposit, whatever you need." He also gave me the name of a friend of his, a woman who ran a non-profit that helped women fleeing domestic abuse. "It's not just for women who've been hit, Catherine," he said gently, seeing the hesitation on my face. "Abuse takes many forms. They can help with legal aid, job placement, counseling. They'll understand." That phone call was the next brick in my wall. The woman I spoke to, Maria, had a voice that was calm and strong. I told her my story, stumbling over the words, feeling foolish and ashamed. The steak and the bread, it sounded so petty, so trivial when I said it out loud. I was afraid she would laugh at me, but she didn't. She just listened. And when I was done, she said, "That's not petty, Catherine. That's a classic narcissistic power play. Using food to control and humiliate is one of the oldest tricks in the book. You did the right thing. You got your children out. You're incredibly brave." I started to cry, the validation from a stranger cracking open a dam of emotion I had been holding back. She gave me an appointment for the next day. The retaliation from my mother began in earnest that afternoon. The first salvo came from my sister. My phone rang, and Sarah's name flashed on the screen. My hand trembled as I answered. "Kate?" Her voice was strained. "What have you done? Mom is a wreck. She's worried sick. You just disappeared." I could hear the script she'd been fed. I could almost hear my mother's voice whispering in her ear. "I didn't just disappear, Sarah. I left. There's a difference. You took the kids. You didn't even say goodbye. You left a one-line note like a teenager running away from home. Mom found it and had a panic attack. Mark had to calm her down. She thinks you've had some kind of breakdown." A breakdown, of course. That was the narrative. I wasn't a victim escaping abuse. I was a mentally unstable daughter having an episode. It was perfect. It absolved them of all responsibility. "Sarah, you were there," I said, my voice low and shaking with a fury I was trying to control. "You saw what she did. You sat there and watched her make my children cry over a piece of meat." There was a pause. I heard her take a shaky breath. "She was trying to make a point," she said, her voice weak. "She's just worried about your finances. It came out wrong. You know how she gets. She's just old-fashioned. You overreacted." Overreacted. The word was a slap in the face. The ultimate gaslighting tool. For my entire life, I had been overreacting. My feelings were too big. My reactions too dramatic. I was too sensitive. It was the family motto, and Sarah was its most loyal parrot. "No, Sarah," I said, and my voice was suddenly clear and cold. For the first time in my life, I reacted appropriately. "I am not coming back. I am not discussing this with you. If you want to be a part of my life and my children's lives, you will have to do it without her. You're going to have to choose." I could hear her sputtering on the other end of the line, but I hung up. I blocked her number. Then I blocked my mother's number. Then I blocked Mark's. I sat there, my heart pounding. I had just severed the final ties. I had drawn the line in the sand. Now I just had to pray I had the strength to hold it. The days that followed were a blur of frantic activity, a desperate scramble to build a new life from scratch. I met with Maria from the support center. She was a godsend. She connected me with a pro bono lawyer who specialized in family issues. The lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Davies, helped me draft a formal letter to my mother, delivered by a process server, stating that I was safe, the children were safe, and any further contact should go through her office. It was a cease and desist for the soul. It was a legal shield against the emotional onslaught I knew was coming. Ms. Davies also helped me navigate the infuriating bureaucracy of getting my name off the joint bank account and filing a report about the stolen money, though she warned me it was unlikely I'd ever see it again. Maria also put me in touch with a job placement program. I had a background in administrative work from before my life fell apart, and they found me a temporary position as a receptionist at a small, quiet accounting firm. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't pay much, but it was mine. It was a paycheck with only my name on it. It was freedom. The biggest hurdle was finding an apartment. The check from Uncle David was a lifesaver, but the rental market was brutal. I spent every lunch break and every evening after the kids were asleep scouring listings, making calls, and filling out applications. I faced rejection after rejection. My credit was shot from the divorce, and my employment history was spotty. I was a single mother with 2 young children, the trifecta of undesirable tenants. The character assassination campaign my mother launched was insidious. She couldn't reach me directly, so she went through the rest of the family. My phone started ringing with calls from aunts and cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. The message was always the same. "Catherine, I just spoke to your mother. She's heartbroken. She loves you so much. She's just worried. Can't you just call her? Can't you work this out? Family is everything." They had all been fed the same story. I was unstable, ungrateful, and I had cruelly ripped her grandchildren away from a loving grandmother out of spite. She painted herself as the victim, the benevolent matriarch whose kindness had been thrown back in her face, and they believed her. It was easier to believe her than to confront the uncomfortable truth that the smiling woman who sent them Christmas cards every year was capable of such calculated cruelty. Each call was a fresh wave of doubt and guilt. Was I doing the right thing? Was I being selfish? Was I destroying my family over a single, stupid dinner? Then I would look at my children. I would see the change in them. In the safety of Uncle David's apartment, they were blossoming. Leo, who had become quiet and withdrawn at my mother's house, was telling jokes again. Maya, who had developed a nervous stutter, was speaking in full, clear sentences. They played without looking over their shoulders. They ate without fear. They were healing. And that was all the proof I needed. I was not destroying my family. I was saving it. I started documenting everything. Following the advice of my therapist, a woman Maria had also recommended, I bought a simple notebook. Every day I would write. I wrote down the steak and bread incident in excruciating detail, from the smell of the garlic to the look on Maya's face. Then I started going backwards. I wrote down every cruel word, every backhanded compliment, every time she had pitted me against Sarah, every time she had dismissed my feelings as an overreaction. I wrote about the time she forgot to pick me up from my junior prom, leaving me stranded for hours. I wrote about the time she told my ex-husband in front of me that she didn't blame him for leaving, that I was a difficult woman to love. The notebook filled up with years of poison I had unknowingly swallowed. Each memory I put on paper was an act of exorcism. It was painful, agonizing work, but with each page, the gaslighting lost its power. The events were real. The hurt was real. I wasn't crazy. I was a survivor. This meticulous process of documentation became my shield. When the doubts crept in, when a well-meaning relative called to tell me I was breaking my mother's heart, I would open the notebook. I would read my own words, my own history, and I would remember why I had to leave. One evening, about 3 weeks after our escape, Sarah showed up at the apartment unannounced. I have no idea how she found the address. She must have followed David. I saw her through the peephole, standing in the hallway, looking nervous and uncertain. My first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home, but then I looked at my own reflection in the tiny lens, a distorted fisheye version of myself. I was tired of hiding. I opened the door. "How did you find me?" I asked, my voice flat. I didn't invite her in. I stood in the doorway, a human barrier. "I had to see you, Kate," she said, her eyes pleading. "This has gone on long enough. She's not doing well. That is no longer my problem, Sarah." "How can you say that? She's our mother." "She stopped being my mother in any meaningful way a long time ago," I said, the words tasting like metal. "She became my warden, and I've served my time." She flinched. "That's not fair. She gave you a place to live when you had nowhere else to go." "A place to live is not a home," I countered. "A home is where you feel safe. A home is where you are loved. A home is where your children don't get served bread for dinner while everyone else eats steak just to teach their mother a lesson." I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Shame, maybe. Guilt. But it was quickly extinguished, replaced by the familiar defensiveness. "She was wrong," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "What she did was wrong, but you're punishing her so harshly. You're punishing all of us. Amelia and James missed their cousins." It was a low blow, using the children. It was a tactic straight from our mother's playbook. "Then you are welcome to bring your children to a park to play with my children," I said, my voice cold and even. "But she is not to be there, and you are not to speak of her. Those are the terms. If you can't accept them, then I guess our children won't be seeing each other for a while." while. Her face crumpled. This was not how the scene was supposed to play out. She was supposed to be the reasonable sister talking her hysterical sibling off the ledge. She wasn't prepared for me to have boundaries. She wasn't prepared for me to have power. It's not that simple, Kate. You're asking me to choose. Yes, I said. I am. Because she made me choose a long time ago between her and my own sanity. And I am finally choosing myself. I am choosing my children. Now who do you choose, Sarah? She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. She was the golden child, the one who had always thrived by pleasing our mother. To defy her was unthinkable. It would mean risking her own comfortable place in the family hierarchy. It would mean the cold, critical gaze of our mother might finally turn on her. She couldn't do it. I saw the decision in her eyes before she even spoke. I can't, she whispered, shaking her head. She's my mother. I know, I said, and for the first time, I felt a pang of pity for her. She was as much a prisoner as I had been, just in a more gilded cage. I slowly closed the door, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. That was the last time I saw her for a very long time. The breakthrough came a week later. I finally found an apartment. It was a tiny 2-bedroom unit on the second floor of a walk-up, with scuffed floors and a temperamental radiator, but it was clean. It was in a good school district, and the landlord, a kind-faced older woman who reminded me of my grandmother, looked at my application, looked at me and said, "Everyone deserves a fresh start." I signed the lease with a hand that didn't shake. I paid the deposit and the first month's rent with the money from Uncle David. Holding the keys to my own place, a place that had no connection to my mother, was a feeling of pure, unadulterated triumph. Moving in was a chaotic, joyful affair. Uncle David helped me rent a small truck. We had so few possessions that it only took a few hours. We bought cheap mattresses and assembled them on the floor. We ate takeout pizza sitting on cardboard boxes. Leo and Maya ran through the empty rooms, their shouts echoing off the bare walls. This was their space. Our space. That night, after I tucked them into their new beds in their new room, I sat on the floor of the empty living room and cried. Not tears of sadness or fear, but tears of profound, bone-deep relief. We were home. Life slowly began to take on a new rhythm. I worked during the day while the kids were at their new school. I would pick them up in the afternoon, and we would do homework at our small, secondhand kitchen table. I cooked simple meals, pasta, chicken, tacos, and one Friday night, I used my first full paycheck to buy 3 of the best-looking steaks I could find at the grocery store. I cooked them in a hot pan with butter and garlic, just like she had. I served them to my children with roasted potatoes and green beans. We sat at our wobbly table, on our mismatched chairs, and we ate. And as I watched my children devour their dinner, their faces glowing with happiness, I knew I had made the right choice. This was what a family meal was supposed to feel like. It wasn't about the food. It was about the love. The legal process of untangling my life from hers was slow and draining. Ms. Davies was a rock. She guided me through the labyrinth of paperwork required to establish myself as a fully independent entity. We discovered that my mother, in her role as my financial manager, had not only drained my bank account, but had also opened a credit card in my name months earlier, racking up several $1,000s in debt. It was a staggering betrayal, a discovery that left me breathless with rage. It was also a crucial piece of evidence. My mother's narrative of me being a financially irresponsible drain was hard to maintain when confronted with a clear case of fraud. This discovery became the evidentiary turning point. It shifted the dynamic from a messy family dispute to a potential criminal case. Ms. Davies advised me to file a police report for identity theft. The thought terrified me. This would escalate things to a level from which there was no return. It would mean facing her not just across a dinner table, but potentially across a courtroom. It meant the war would no longer be a cold one, fought with whispered rumors and manipulative phone calls, but a hot one, fought with lawyers and depositions. I spent a week agonizing over the decision. I talked it through with my therapist, with Uncle David. Was it worth it? Couldn't I just eat the debt and move on? But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. It was about the fact that she had used my vulnerability, my trust, to exploit me. She had done it believing she would never be caught, that I would be too scared, too broken to fight back. If I let this go, I would be proving her right. I would be letting her win. So I walked into a police station, my hands shaking, my notebook of evidence clutched in my bag, and I filed the report. A detective, a weary-looking man named Peterson, listened to my story with a practiced air of professional detachment. But as I laid out the timeline, as I showed him the bank statements, the credit card bills sent to her address, and my own detailed notes, I saw his expression shift. He started taking notes. He asked sharp, specific questions. By the end of our meeting, he looked at me and said, "Ma'am, what your mother did is a felony." The investigation was a slow, grinding process. It involved search warrants for financial records, subpoenas for bank documents. Detective Peterson interviewed my mother. I can only imagine how that went. She would have played the part of the concerned, confused mother, baffled by her unstable daughter's wild accusations. But the paper trail was undeniable. The credit card had been used to buy things for her house, to pay for her car repairs, to fund a weekend trip for her and Sarah. The lies couldn't stand up to the cold, hard facts of the receipts. The family predictably imploded. When they found out I had gone to the police, the trickle of concerned phone calls became a flood of furious ones. I was tearing the family apart. I was sending my own mother to jail. How could I be so heartless, so vindictive? I stopped answering the phone altogether. I let everything go to voicemail. My home, my tiny second-floor walk-up, became my fortress. Inside its walls, with my children, I was safe from the storm raging outside. The day came came when the district attorney's office called. They had enough evidence to press charges for fraud and identity theft. They offered my mother a plea deal: plead guilty to a lesser charge, pay full restitution, and serve 2 years of probation. If she refused, they would take the case to trial. For weeks, we heard nothing. I learned through Uncle David that she had hired an expensive lawyer. She was going to fight it. She was going to stand in a courtroom and claim that I had given her permission to use my name, that I was a liar, that this was all a vindictive fantasy I had cooked up because she had cut me off financially. She was going to try to destroy me on a public stage. The formal confrontation I had been dreading was no longer a hypothetical family dinner. It was going to be a preliminary hearing in a sterile, impersonal courtroom. I would have to get on a stand and testify against my own mother. I would have to tell the story of the steak and the bread, of the drained bank account, of the stolen identity, under oath, while her lawyer tried to rip me to shreds. The thought made me physically ill. I had nightmares for weeks. I nearly backed out a dozen times. My therapist worked with me on grounding techniques, on how to stay present and calm under pressure. She taught me to focus on my breathing, to feel my feet on the floor, to remember why I was doing this. I wasn't just doing it for me. I was doing it for my children. I was doing it to show them that you don't let bullies win, no matter who they are. The day of the hearing arrived. I wore my best professional outfit, a simple black dress I'd bought at a thrift store. Uncle David sat in the gallery, a silent pillar of support. I saw her across the room, sitting next to her lawyer. She looked smaller than I remembered, and older. She refused to look at me. Sarah was not there. When my name was called, I walked to the witness stand, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I sat in the chair and swore the oath, my voice a reedy whisper. The prosecutor, a young, earnest woman, began her questions. She had me recount the story from the beginning, leaving my ex-husband, losing my job, moving into my mother's house. I told them about the control, the constant criticism, the feeling of being a prisoner. I told them about the bank account. Then she asked me about the night I left. What was the final straw, Ms. Evans? I took a deep breath. I looked at the judge, a stern-faced woman with tired eyes. It was a Sunday dinner, I began, and I told them everything. I told them about the smell of the steak, about my sister's perfect family, about my children's hopeful faces. I told them how my mother served everyone else, and how she placed a basket of plain bread in front of me and my 2 small children. I told them her exact words. She looked at me, and she said, "You'll be fine with just bread." As I spoke, the courtroom was silent. I wasn't looking at my mother, but I could feel the weight of her hatred like a physical force. I could feel her lawyer getting ready to pounce. The prosecutor continued, presenting the evidence. The bank statements showing the withdrawal the morning after I left. The credit card statements with my name and her address, filled with purchases I had never made. The testimony from Detective Peterson. It was a methodical, damning presentation of facts. Then, it was the defense attorney's turn. He was a slick, expensive-looking man with a cruel smile. He approached the stand like a predator. His strategy was clear from the first question. Paint me as an unhinged, vindictive, and unreliable narrator. "Ms. Evans," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've been through a lot, haven't you? A difficult divorce, job loss. You've admitted to being under a great deal of stress. Yes, you were depressed, weren't you? Seeing a therapist? I was in a difficult situation. I sought help. Yes. So it's possible that your memory of events is colored by this emotional distress. No, my memory is perfectly clear." He paced back and forth, peppering me with questions designed to make me look foolish and petty. He tried to frame the Sunday dinner as a simple misunderstanding, a clumsy attempt by a mother to teach her daughter about budgeting. "It was just a meal, wasn't it, Ms. Evans? A piece of steak. Are you really asking this court to believe that your mother, a respected member of her community, would engage in a complex financial fraud, all because of a squabble over a Sunday roast?" I looked him straight in the eye. I felt my feet on the floor. I took a slow, deep breath. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and strong. "That is exactly what I am asking the court to believe, because it was never about the steak. It was about power. It was about humiliation. It was about showing me my place. The fraud was just another tool she used to control me. It was all part of the same pattern of abuse." I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected me to crumble. He had expected tears and hysterics. He had not expected calm, cold resolve. He tried a few more lines of attack, but his questions lost their sting. He had lost control of the narrative. I had taken it back. When he was finished, I stepped down from the stand, my body trembling with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I had done it. I had faced her, and I had told the truth, and I had not broken. The judge called for a recess. As we filed out of the courtroom, my mother's lawyer approached the prosecutor. They spoke in low, urgent tones. Uncle David put his arm around my shoulders. "You were incredible," he whispered. "I am so proud of you." 20 minutes later, we were called back in. My mother and her lawyer were standing before the judge. She looked pale and shaken. Her lawyer did all the talking. "Your Honor, after consultation with my client, she has decided to change her plea. She will accept the district attorney's original offer." A wave of shock, then profound, dizzying relief washed over me. She had folded. Faced with the undeniable evidence and my refusal to be intimidated, she had folded. She pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of financial misconduct. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, a series of fines, and was ordered to pay full restitution for the debt she had created and the money she had stolen. It was a victory, but it was a bittersweet one. She would never serve a day in jail. The plea deal meant the full scope of her psychological abuse. The years of cruelty that led up to the fraud would never be formally acknowledged by the court. Justice was served. deserved, but it felt incomplete. She walked out of the courthouse a free woman, a convicted criminal on probation, but free nonetheless. I did not watch her go. I turned and walked in the opposite direction with my uncle toward my new life. In the months that followed, I focused on healing. The restitution checks started arriving, and I used them to pay off the fraudulent debt and build a small emergency fund. I continued with my therapy, processing the imperfect nature of the legal outcome. My therapist helped me understand that true justice, in this case, wasn't about seeing my mother punished. It was about my own liberation. It was about breaking the cycle. The verdict was not the end of the story. It was the end of a chapter. The rest of the book was mine to write. I kept my job at the accounting firm. They were so impressed with my work ethic that they offered me a permanent full-time position with benefits. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely financially independent. I opened a savings account for the kids. I started paying Uncle David back, despite his protests. Rebuilding my life was a slow, practical process. It was about paying bills on time, packing school lunches, reading bedtime stories. It was about creating a rhythm of stability and safety for my children, a predictable world where they knew they were loved and provided for. It was about the quiet, mundane, beautiful work of being a mother on my own terms. I established permanent, non-negotiable boundaries. My mother was blocked on every platform. I returned any mail she sent unopened. When relatives tried to ambush me with phone calls, putting her on the line to offer a tearful non-apology, I learned to say, "I am not having this conversation," and hang up. It was brutally difficult at first. The guilt was a powerful, conditioned response. But each time I enforced the boundary, it got a little easier. My peace of mind and the well-being of my children was more important than anyone else's comfort. One day, about a year after the court case, Sarah called me from a number I didn't recognize. She sounded different, quieter, humbled. She told me she had started seeing a therapist herself. With me gone, our mother's critical, controlling gaze had turned to her, and for the first time, she was starting to see the bars of her own gilded cage. She apologized. A real, tearful, heartfelt apology for her cowardice, for her complicity. She asked if she could, slowly, try to be a sister to me again, an aunt to my children. I was hesitant, but I agreed to meet her, alone, in a neutral space. It was the beginning of a long, slow process of rebuilding, but it was a beginning. My story doesn't end with a perfect storybook resolution. The scars are still there. There are days when a certain smell, a phrase, a tone of voice will send a jolt of the old fear and anger through me. The damage done to my children, to their sense of security, is something we are still working to heal. My mother will never change. She will go to her grave believing she was the victim. I have come to accept that. I cannot change her, but I can change how I respond. I can refuse to participate in her drama. I can protect myself and my children from her toxicity. Sometimes, on a quiet evening, after Leo and Maya are asleep, I sit in my small living room, the one I pay for with money I earned, and I think about that night. I think about the polished mahogany table, the glint of the silver, the smell of the steak, and I think about the basket of plain, dry bread. It was meant to be a symbol of my worthlessness, my poverty, my place, but for me, it has become something else entirely. It has become a symbol of my freedom. It was the insult that finally woke me up. It was the cruelty that finally gave me the strength to leave. It was the rock bottom from which I started to build my new life. A life that is small and simple and sometimes difficult, but it is a life that is authentically, completely, and finally mine. And in this life, we always have more than enough. Everyone gets a seat at the table, and no one ever again will be fine with just bread. If you've stuck around for this whole thing, congratulations. You have the patience of a saint, or you're really, really good at multitasking. I'm impressed, honestly. I barely have the patience to listen to my own stories, and I was there, but seriously, thank you for listening. It means a lot. If you want to hear more tales of questionable family dinners and eventual hard-won triumph, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. It's free, and unlike my mother's love, it comes with no strings attached.